Great. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Myra Alvarez, President of the Children's Partnership. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the Census 2020 and what messaging research tells us about counting young Californians. We would like to thank our partners, First Five Association of California and Children Now, for their help in coordinating today's webinar. And special thanks to our invited guests, Deb Stein from the Partnership for America's Children and Celinda Lake from Lake Research and Associates. Today's webinar will highlight findings based on focus groups and a statewide online survey conducted in California. We're excited to hear more about what families need from us as advocates and partners to work together and ensuring everyone, and especially our youngest, are counted. Before we begin, colleagues from First Five, Children Now, and I will briefly share how California organizations can look to us as partners in our shared goals around the Census 2020. Let's start with our colleague, Josefina Ramirez Natsana from Children Now, to talk to us about what Children Now is doing. After her, we will hear from Kendra Devejian from First Five, and then we will finally hear from TCP before I hand it over to Deb. Josefina?
Thank you, Myra. Next slide, please. Okay, to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Great, perfect. So I'm Josefina Ramirez Natsana. I am a Senior Associate of Government Relations for Children Now. I focus on public affairs and advocacy to create successful legislative, community outreach, and media relations campaigns. For the past 2 years, Children Now has participated in the Census Policy Advocacy Network. It's a statewide coalition comprised of, now it's 21 statewide national organizations reflecting hard-to-count populations, ethnic, racial communities, including Native American, housing advocates, LGBTQ, immigrant rights and refugees, and children. CPAN, as a partner in the CPAN work here at the state level and in LA County as well, we have been contributing to the coalition by providing leadership and advice and data to inform policy discussions and to ensure that children and families with young children are part of all of the conversations when we're talking about advocacy and outreach. So we were very successful in the first, in 2018, 2019, with the state budget including $90.3 million over the next 3 years to support census outreach, and that was a $50 million increase from the original proposal. And this past year, we were successful in securing additional resources, $84 million for outreach and $2 million for outreach by public schools. And, you know, we're really excited about the partnership that we've developed with our legislative leaders and with the California Complete Count Census Office and leaders there. And I think in terms of, in addition to our successful budget advocacy, we support the coalition by, you know, creating those opportunities to engage with policymakers and leaders in the administration, as well as ensuring that the agency leaders are listening to some of the issues and concerns that are raising up. We also help as part of Children Now with our children's movement, which with the air coverage, ensuring that our network of 3,400 diverse members across California, including business, education, parents, civil rights, and faith and community-based organizations can be effectively mobilized to represent children's interests across a variety of policy areas. And we share through our children's movement listserv regionally specific messaging and opportunities for folks to engage in training and local engagement events throughout the state, and with a particular focus on LA County and the Central Valley. So we're really excited about the growing partnerships and working with partners like the First Five Association and the Children's Partnership, and, you know, getting the word out about great events that are happening and not reinventing the wheel. But look forward to seeing more about this presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Kendra?
Great. Well, next slide. Next slide. So my name is Kendra Devejian, and I am the Census Project Director with the First Five Association. And I was really excited to get to be part of this work. We started back in January, really kind of looking at what we could bring in terms of the strength of our leadership and the power of our First Five network across the state to really be able to make sure that every child 0 to 5 is counted in the census next year. So we have currently been supported by both the Hayden-Simons Foundation and the Bechtel Foundation to really make sure we're engaging our most hard-to-count families. So what we've really learned from the last 2 decades of working with families across the state is really how to best engage with them, how to build upon the trusted messenger network that we have. So we have been, working in partnership with both the state census office and our regional partners and statewide partners, both the administrative community-based organizations that have been serving the different regions, as well as the sector leads. And so we have been working on tapping into our trusted messenger network in terms of family care providers, our home visitors, looking at our family resource centers, as well as the extensive vast array of health partners that we have. And then we've also been partnering with groups like NALEO, who is the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. They are our Spanish outreach partner. And we're also partnering with the Head Start and WIC associations to tap into their networks across the state. Next slide. So specifically, we are deploying our trusted messenger strategy. So we are first and foremost supporting all of our First Fives across the state. Each county is developing a local 0 to 5 census outreach plan. So while we know that there are broader outreach plans for census, we know that kids 0 to 5 are the only group that actually crosses every other sector and demographic. So when we think about Latino families, when we think about kids in migrant communities, seniors, all of those folks touch kids 0 to 5 in some way. So we're really making sure our First Fives are providing leadership and capacity to help support their local complete counts committee and making sure they have a very specific 0 to 5 outreach plan. We also have just recently, and they actually are all coming on board this week, we have hired regional coordinators across the state. So we have coordinators in one in Sacramento, the Central Valley. We have support in the Inland Empire area, and then we're partnering with NALEO for the Central Coast, and then also Sacramento, in the Bay Area. So in addition to that, we've hired a trainer. So we have a statewide trainer that is going to be providing capacity to do that. And we are really excited. We hope that all of you, as you're hearing this great information today, that you will tap into our abilities as well in our capacity to be able to support trainings in your communities, whether they be with your caregiving community, whether they be with your different community leaders. We have a lot of different trainings we can do. We also are hosting monthly webinars. They're the second Tuesday of every month. And we're doing those to make sure that we're covering all of the different topics and all of the different sectors related to census outreach. And then lastly, we have, we're really excited that we will be partnering with the state Complete Counts team, as well as our State First Five on developing a whole communications campaign that's specifically targeted 0 to 5. Really excited to have them be able to leverage all of the great work and research that is being presented here today. And so all of those assets will be available for all of you to be able to utilize in your on-the-ground strategies as well. Next slide. So here's our contact info. As I said, we've kind of really framed ourselves as kind of the pit crew for 0 to 5 across the state. Again, we are serving as the leads for the state census team as well in providing 0 to 5 support. So please reach out to us if there's anything that we can do to help support your 0 to 5 outreach efforts in your communities. I'll toss it back to Myra. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendra. Next slide, please. So thanks, everybody, again for joining today. At the Children's Partnership, we're very excited to work closely with partners on this webinar and all of you that are with us and many others to get out the count for young children and their families. Especially here in California, we know the risk of an undercount of young children. As you'll hear on the webinar today, young children are the most undercounted but the risk of that undercount is higher in our state given the diversity of our communities and our child population. 3 out of 4 children in California are from a community of color, and half are part of an immigrant family. And in today's political climate, we know that many of our families, too many of them, are living in fear and are having a growing distrust of public programs, and it's causing confusion and anxiety and really a reluctance to participate in the very programs that we know they benefit from. This is also influencing knowledge of the census or a willingness to participate. We at the Children's Partnership are really here to work with our partners like First 5, Children Now, NALEO, and a number of others across the state and based in our communities to help make sure our families have the information they need. Today, we're excited to share that we released our Census 2020 Toolkit. Next slide, please. We are specifically targeting this toolkit for educators. We know that teachers, early learning providers, and education officials are all sources of trust for many of our students' families, and we're counting on you to help make sure that our families, our young children are counted. Education leaders and school officials within our communities can share information and encourage families to participate in the 2020 census, and we hope that using our resources, it makes that job just a little bit easier. We released a social media toolkit today that includes a variety of sample messages and graphics that you can post not only on your Facebook and Twitter pages, but also distribute through your emails to families and utilize in other communications to families to ensure that they're aware of the upcoming census and their participation and the importance of it. We've also, based on feedback from our community partners, have tried to come up with new and innovative ways to encourage families to participate and have created pledge cards to demonstrate that commitment from families and from educators themselves in supporting us in this effort, in our collective effort to make sure every young child, every Californian is counted. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be releasing additional resources for families, for educators in participating in the census, and we look forward to working with you to ensure that those resources are utilized in our community. We believe we all have a role to play in supporting families and their participation in the 2020 census, and as you've heard from all of our panelists thus far, we are all here to make sure that you feel supported in those efforts. Next slide, please. So with that, I will hand it over to Deb Stein to introduce Celinda Lake and get us started.
Great, thank you, Myra. Next slide, please. I want to give you guys a little background on what research we asked Celinda to do. So the problem for us, of course, is that the number of young children ages birth to 4 that have been missed in the decennial census is large and it's growing. We missed over 2 million young children nationwide in 2010, over 100,000 in California alone, and that's been growing since 1980. We also know that young children are often, maybe mostly, left off the form when families respond to the census. So it's not enough to try and get the families to respond to the census. We also need messages that persuade families to include their young children when they respond. Next slide, please. So when we asked Celinda and her colleagues to undertake research on how to persuade families to include their children, here's the information that we gave them as we designed the study. Many kids are left off the form when families respond. Children are more likely to be missed if they live in what's called a complex household. That's pretty much anything except 1 or 2 parents and the children. So it can be grandparents, parents, children, it can be grandparents, grandchildren, it can be an aunt or uncle raising the children or more distant relatives, or it can be 2 households that are sharing space because one of them is homeless or they cannot afford separate apartments. We also know young children are more likely to be missed when the person filling out the form is not their parent. Children of color are more likely to be missed. These were all things that we knew were potential factors and that we asked Celinda to look at. Next slide, please. We also had some research identifying communities where many children were at risk of being missed. And that research really found 4 factors. One was a very high share of racial and ethnic minorities. Another was a high share of households that are linguistically isolated, not necessarily bilingual, but rather households where English is not a language that they are very comfortable working in at all. Communities with a lot of young children living with grandparent householders, that's more than just having grandparents in the house. It's when the grandparent is sort of the householder and they fill out the form. So if a grandparent is living with a parent and their children, but the parents live out the form, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about grandparents with or without the parents in the household, leaving the grandchildren off. And then also they're more at risk of being missed if they're not related to the person filling out the form or not closely related. Next slide, please. So here's the goals we set as we went into this research. We wanted to find out what parents and other householders with young children know about the census and what they think about participating in it. We wanted to learn what they understand about including young children in the census and what concerns they have about it. We wanted to find messages that move parents and other householders to respond, because there is also a problem with response, and to include young children when they do. And we wanted to at least take a stab at identifying messages that make immigrant households more likely to count their young children. Nationwide, we have almost 2 million young children, almost all of whom are citizens, who are living with at least one undocumented adult in the household. But we also know in this political environment, even documented immigrants are concerned and might be reluctant to respond or count their young children. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to turn this over to Celinda. Celinda is the founder and leads Lake Research Partners, which is one of the best known and I think most highly respected national public opinion research firms. And we were really delighted that she was able to take this on. She's been also doing some other research around the census. So she came to it with a really broad and deep background on it. Celinda?
Thank you so much. And I want to acknowledge the whole team here, Alicia Snell, Kate Gormley, Jesse Klein, who are all very, very involved in this research. And it really was a team effort. And I want to really thank Deb for her intellectual force as well as her vision in this research, and for finding the resources to actually have a thorough understanding, and many of you all who participated in the brainstorming. So the first thing we did focus groups in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Stockton, and we did them with many of the more vulnerable populations, parents and grandparents living in multi-generational households, mixed-race single mothers, parents and grandparents living, and we try to do more than one of each kind so we get a comprehensive understanding, and then low-income white parents and low-income immigrant Latinos in Spanish with less than 10 years in the United States. We then, if we look at the next slide, administered a survey of 860 California parents with children under 5 years who make less than $50,000 a year. So low-income California parents with children under 5. And we have at the same time, and we'll share with you, a nationwide survey that was done in a similar population with similar questions, and so we can compare the answers and get a better sense of what is really moving people. One thing I would say and emphasize is, of course, California has more of the kinds of situations and families where we are likely to see parents not counting children or children undercounted by other adults who have responsibility for them. So we're going to go through the findings, and if we turn to slide 9, and we're going to look at what were views of the census and levels of information. How did people approach filling out this census? Where did they want to do it? How did they want to do it? What motivated them to be more likely to do it? Who were the demographics, the least likely to count children or the least likely to fill it out? What were the messages that were strongest? And then the citizenship question, which we had polled actually before and did the focus groups before the Supreme Court decision. in terms of the groups. So when we just ask people right off the bat, what is the census, a lot of people have initial associations, and they associate it with people, population, many. They also associate it at this point with the word illegal and aliens in terms of initial associations, and aware of the controversies around citizenship. Not as aware of the citizenship question, as at least I had anticipated. In the survey, a majority of low-income parents with children under 5 were familiar with the census, 61%, although only 25% very familiar, and about a third were unfamiliar. Familiarity nationally and in California were about the same. Most people in any demographic and attitudinal group are familiar with the census. People that were most familiar in California, dads more familiar than moms, Democrats and Republicans much more familiar than independents. And in fact, if you want to do some targeting, actually, not for the purposes of any kind of political activity, but the partisan score of the registration is very helpful for targeting people who are less likely to have information and therefore also less likely to fill out the census. Married, more likely than unmarried people. People connected to some other organization. And we found this was very powerful in California and very powerful in the national survey, that people who are attached to church or attend churches are much more likely to fill it out than people who are not. One of the variables that you're going to hear us repeat over and over and over again, and Deb mentioned it already, is stability. Stability and permanence of residence, stability of family composition, huge, huge, huge predictor. And of course, variation, diversity, and instability is on the rise, and really on the rise in California, which means that California really at risk for a lot of undercounting if there aren't efforts like the kinds being outlined on this call. People in Fresno and the Bay Area are more likely to be familiar. The people less likely to be familiar, mothers. Now that's really serious because it's mothers who are often very, very engaged about children under 5. Unmarried parents, people who aren't connected to institutions, San Diego, urban mothers. One of the groups we found nationwide was the rural population. The rural population in California is more oriented, actually, to participating in the census and counting children. It's the urban population that is particularly at risk. Renters, who are much less familiar with the census, and independents. And a majority of independents said they are not familiar. The reason we care about knowledge about the census is that knowledge about the census is an independent predictor of whether you would fill it out and whether you will fill it out with all the children counted. If we look at the next slide, half of the parents say they have filled out the census before, and that's very similar to the national number. 3 in 10 say they haven't filled it out, and they tend to be the younger, less educated, more female, and more people of color. And 22% say they can't remember. Residential stability, a huge predictor of how knowledgeable the parents are, if they've had any experience with the census, their willingness to fill it out, and their willingness or their having a correct perception in terms of counting all of the children. What helps a lot, and you'll see this in the messaging, and we'll come back to this thought quite a bit, is linking the census to the services. And people's understanding of the census is very keenly tied to division of resources and provision of services. So people already have that storyline in their head. There are 2 tiers of services that really jump up when people are thinking about the census in California and then when they are thinking about children. First, it's housing and transportation. But more housing in the community, more affordable housing. People are very concerned that the homeless will be missed by the census, and they are very, very concerned that one of the resources that they need more, the local problems that they need more national resources for, is housing and affordable housing. And if you have an undercount in the census, you're going to get less housing. Transportation, also very important issue to Californians. What was interesting is they connected that to the census as well. And that was a little surprising. At first, people don't particularly think of housing and transportation as children's issues. But then after they talk about the services not being provided by the census, they do connect it to children. The other services and resources that they connect to children are education and healthcare services. And they think if there is an undercount of children, that you will have less of education and healthcare as well. So question is, the next slide, slide 11, shows you the initial response to the question and then after people had heard our messages. So initially, 73% of people say I'm likely to fill it out, and 51% say very likely. Now, on something like this, people always upgrade their answers. So these are good numbers, but they're not great numbers. We would like that 51% very likely to be higher. At the end of the survey, 76% say likely, 57% say very likely. And that's a good gain. I think if we had only the message track that really worked, we would make even more gains there. We tested a lot of different things, and so it was some things that were appealing and some things that weren't. And if we had a message track, and we have one now out of this surveying, I think we could increase those numbers even more. But people remember what they said. This is only a short interview. They want to be consistent, and so these are pretty good gains. You can see on the next slide the number of folks who are very likely at the end of the survey to fill this out. So you have 82% of white parents, 63% very likely. Among Latinx, it's 77% and 55%, and among Spanish-speaking parents, 77% and 57% very likely. In a lot of the data, we didn't find as much difference between Latinx and Spanish-speaking Latinx families. And we had expected more difference. There are a couple of places, but not a lot. Part of that is that there's already been a lot of communication in Spanish-speaking families, and that is a very good thing, and it's a credit to the people on this group. On the next slide, when we asked people how would they be most likely to fill out the census, they said overwhelmingly online. And this has been a change. People really, really oriented to doing it online now. 59% said they would prefer it online, 18% by mail, 6% by phone, 9% say they have no preference. Among Latinx parents, 58% prefer it online, and among Spanish-speaking parents, 60% prefer it online. Several things are happening here. One thing that's happening is people are really preferring it online because online penetration has really increased. And in the last few years, we're seeing there's still some important groups of voters, but this is low-income families with children under 5, and we have seen some pretty dramatic penetration online in terms of filling it out. It used to be that people liked on the phone because they thought that they could get help in real time. They liked paper because they thought they could get help from other family members. Interestingly, those things came up a little bit, but not as much as you would think. And people thought, well, I can Google in real time too and get answers, and I can bring the family members that I'm most likely to ask will be family members who will be very facile online too. So people didn't see this as much an advantage for mail and phone as we've seen in the past. Now, parents nationally slightly more likely to fill out online than California, and we had expected actually for it to be the reverse, but still pretty high numbers. When people talk about what they like online, they like convenience, they like the environmental friendliness. They say they no longer open their mail unless it's a bill, a check, or regularly expected mail. Some of the young parents said they don't even get the mail. And nobody's for door-to-door census anymore. They think it's way too intrusive, threatening. They don't answer the door. They don't want to answer the door. And they're very nervous about the implications of security and privacy in terms of opening the door. Convenience, you'll see in a moment, a very, very big variable. And we are not emphasizing convenience enough at all. We're emphasizing privacy, which is important, but ironically, convenience is even more important to these parents of young children. And one of the things that we've found, one of the reasons we brought it in, is we have found the same thing in terms of voter registration and voter participation, that convenience is really soaring as something to emphasize and a great way to increase participation. On the next slide, convenience more persuasive than privacy. That's true for whites, for Latinx, and for Spanish-speaking Latinx. People really found it compelling that you could fill the census out on your own schedule. Women really love that, and that it only takes 10 minutes to complete. And you can see here some real intensity, 69% more likely, 47% much more likely. Highlighting privacy is good too, but convenience beats privacy. Californian parents, a little more cynical than parents nationally. Californians are quite cynical about things, and in fact, the best messages, by the way, rely on demonstrating that you can solve a problem by filling out the census. But Californians are a little bit more cynical than parents nationwide, and that's the important thing that we make sure that we don't enhance in our messaging. Here on the next slide, slide 15, you can see the numbers, and you can see that convenience on the on the left, privacy on the right, both important, but convenience even more important and more intense than privacy. It also helps in the privacy, by the way, to add the penalty. We found in the focus group that saying that it was one of the strongest privacy guarantees in the federal government didn't really work for people. Saying that there'd never been a violations didn't really work for people. People think in the Trump era it's really different, and this has been true in the nationwide work that we've done as well. But emphasizing that they could spend up to 5 years in jail and pay a fine as large as $250,000, that did catch people's eye, and people thought, oh, okay, well now you're talking serious here. On slide 16, you can see for whites, convenience beats privacy by 12 points, for Latinx by 12 points, and for Spanish-speaking Latinx, 13 points. So privacy, very important, but convenience even more important, and should definitely be featured much, much more in our messaging than it is right now. 4 in 5 parents responded that they would count their own children under 5. However, a fifth said they would not or were not sure. Unmarried men, the least likely to count their children. And it was very, very clear in the focus groups that unmarried men thought that that the children would already be counted under someone else's count. The most likely to count, the most likely to be unsure whether they should count, directly correlated with how much information you had generally on the census. And it included the people who made below 30,000, the independents again. Partisans have a lot more information than the independents do. People with the lowest levels of education, and people who had, interestingly, lived at their address for a while, still unsure. Now, people that had lived in their address for a while tended to have more experience, but they still weren't exactly sure if they're supposed to count children under 5. The reasons that people said they weren't sure whether to count children or not was that the person felt, I'm just not sure, is this person eligible or not? Or are they supposed to be counted somewhere else? And some people thought that the children were too young to be counted. Many people were flummoxed about what to do where someone else, some other parent has partial or full custody of the child. And children moving around, of which many, many, many children do, if they're not permanent residents of the household, people really weren't clear about whether they should be including them or not, or when they should include them or not. And many of these problems were also very strong in the national survey as well that we did, but all of these circumstances exist in higher numbers in California than a lot of the other numbers nationwide, than in all the other places nationwide. If we look at the next slide, we went through a whole battery of people and asked whether or not you thought this person should be included. And what was really a major factor in people's assumption was, where are the parents living who have custody, and is the child there some of the time but not all of the time? People were really confused about what to do with a child who's there some of the time but not all of the time. And interestingly, we half the people, we informed them beforehand, half the people did not. So half of the people we said, the census counts everyone where they live, sleep most of the time, even if the living arrangement is temporary, so long as the person has no other permanent address. That was very, very helpful if a child stays in a house for several weeks or months, but it was not helpful. It was still not clarifying to people in the grandchild situation. It was not clarifying to people when you stay some days but not all the time. And it was not clarifying to people in terms of someone else that might be residing with them, like a friend who had a young child who isn't there all the time. So the house surfing folks. So that clarification helped a lot if you had a child in the situation for a block of time, a continuous block of time. But if the child is in and out of the household, if the custody is shared, so it's in and out of the household. If it's a friend and the child is in and out of the household, then people really not clear about whether they should be counted or not. Very, very helpful, by the way, to have information in the census form or attached to it that clarified situations. People thought it was great when you could actually see a situation being clarified, and they liked instructions, but they didn't always find the situation applicable to the way they thought about the issue. We then looked at the data from the reverse, which is who is most likely not to be included. And again, we compared it with people being informed and not informed. And again, the information we were providing, would that one little sentence could do it, but wasn't that clarifying to people. People that were most significantly undercounted were a family member and a young child who stays in the household some days but not all the time, the child or grandchild some days, not all the time, and the friend or young child. The instability of the child moving in and out, and the instability of housing, those are the two strongest predictors of not counting. And add on to that shared custody as a secondary thrust. And people just really not sure what to do. We then looked at what kinds of statements made the most difference, and this is the next slide, slide 20, in terms of motivating people to count children and making sure that all the children are counted. And what we found is services are very important, but it's not a transactional relationship. It goes beyond transaction, and you'll see this in the messaging as well. It's about messaging for values as well as getting something. So just talking transactionally isn't as strong as framing things as values as well. And the values here are the future for our children, good education for children. Education isn't just a commodity in California, it's considered a value. You can see that our two strongest testing statements were counting your children in the census means your local schools get more funding for your children, and the census helps local government plan for the future and determines the level of funding, programs, and services young children receive from the federal government, including schools, child care, housing, public transportation, and medical care. Three things that we learned first off. One is keep it local. Even if it's federal money, and people understand that it's federal money, they like the benefits to be local. Keep the program simple and explicit so that people know exactly, not just we're going to get more resources, we're going to divide things up more fairly. No, specifically what is going to benefit here. Numbers don't necessarily help that much. You'll see here that we had programs with and without the $800 billion. Numbers are interesting because people think the numbers are important, but they think the services are very important without the numbers. You don't necessarily have to have a number. It didn't particularly improve our situation. And again, you want to be sure to make things values-oriented, not just transactional. On slide 21, parents reacted very strongly to messages that explained what the census can do for their children. And all of the top messages mentioned that young children have been missed in the past. And people were pretty flabbergasted. They were upset about young children being missed in the past and the numbers. The weakest messages all talked about equal distribution of government funds and resources. It's not vague, it's specific. And it's not so much that people want to know what you're buying. It's not transactional. But they want to be able to envision the difference this is going to make. They want to make it concrete. They really liked it when a clear problem and a clear solution could be outlined. And the impact of the census was very, very powerful as well. They liked inclusion of children from all races and all backgrounds. And they love talking about the future, which they saw as values-oriented. It's not just about the current status. It's not buying something here. It's about investing in the future here and improving their children's lives. And people found very, very powerful a language that we used that the census is only every 10 years, and that could be most of the childhood of your child if they're not counted. And that was like really shocking to people. And we've been using that language in other work that we've been doing on the census and redistricting. It's been quite powerful. And then examples of services: healthcare, school programs, child care, roads, fire departments, hospitals, all of that tested very, very well. On slide 22, you'll see the strongest messages, and you'll see them in the blue column in California and the green column nationally. Now, we think we have a strong message when we're testing at like 45%, very convincing. You can see that our messages here testing 10 points higher than that. So these are very strong messages. And again, it's the same principle, talking about the services and helping young children, painting a problem and solving it, crowded classrooms, busy hospital emergency rooms, and then we're going to provide hospitals and we're going to provide early education. It helped, it was strong to use the 10 million statistic, and that was a very vivid statistic to people. It also helped to talk about the fact that the census is every 10 years. Because people thought, wow, I thought, okay, well, we missed it this year, we catch it next one. But the idea that this is most of a child's childhood and every 10 years, that seemed like a lot to miss. That seemed like a very important thing. The next slide shows the messages by different demographics. The most important thing here is that you will just see that the messages test very similarly across demographics. There are a couple of nuances, but our best messages in general tend to test well everywhere. One thing that is very noticeable is that the more conservative areas also respond better to numbers. They like having numbers. The more progressive areas, more diverse areas, it's like, well, you had me at hello. I like the numbers, but I don't have to have the numbers. But the more conservative areas, like Inland Empire and Fresno, responding to numbers. We looked on slide 24 at 3 different groups of people. People who were likely to shift toward filling the census out, persuadable parents, and what were the reasons that they filled them out. And we found a couple of things. One, the same things tested well nationally and in California. So as we talk to our allies, doing things on a national program and having them filter into California, important as well as what you're going to do locally. It does help to refer to local programs, like local schools, local hospitals, local child care, local services, but it's the same national message, and it's fine that it's federal money for that. People also liked very, very much information, and when you think about who is not filling it out, these are the least informed people, and they tend to be people who are appreciate the information and who appreciate convenience. They have very little time for information, so you can't go on and on with them. They tend to be the youngest parents, the unmarried ones, the non-college educated ones, moms more than dads, renters, the lower income, all of those important groups that were moving in our favor. In terms of the targets in California, many of the things that are unique about California are because of the demographics of the state. But there are some groups that really pop. 66% of the people that shifted our way were Latinx. The 30 to 40-year-olds tend to be a little bit better, but the under 30s really need a lot of attention. And the under 30s tend to have very little information and tend not to have filled out the census in the past because, of course, they were living in house. Often they're under 20. Often it was their parents who filled out the census the last time around. Nationally, we saw some targeting in the rural areas. In California, obviously there are Latinx families in particular and young families everywhere, but we really have issues in the urban areas, and that's the most important place. And then renters, of whom there are a ton in California, obviously, and people who live in, who are unmarried. And the unmarried folks, there were a variety of reasons. Unmarried because they had custodial issues, unmarried because the kids tend to move around a little bit more, unmarried because they tend to be less homeowners and more renters, unmarried because they are swamped and so they have less information about the census. So the unmarried parents are a real target here, really, really important target. The research that we did, the qualitative, was conducted before the Supreme Court ruling, if we move to the next slide. People thought, only about half the people had actually heard about the citizenship question. They had certainly heard about Trump's immigration and racist policies and ICE and all of that, and they were very aware of it. And they thought that fear and paranoia was rising across the nation, rising in California, and that there would be targeting and singling out of immigrants and making them fearful, and that would have real impact. And people were very, very aware that that the whole immigration, it was more the immigration fight that than necessarily the citizenship question per se that was embedded here. Half the people had not heard about the citizenship question. More parents in California had heard than nationwide, but you still had a lot of parents in California that had not heard. And it followed very much information levels, general information levels, not preoccupation with immigration. In fact, over half of Latinx and Spanish-speaking parents had not heard of the citizenship question. So I think in terms of relevancy here, our point is we have a problem for sure, and in California we have a problem, and that problem derives not just from the citizenship question, but frankly from the overall context of the immigration fight. And that is going to be very, very important to people. You can see on slide 28 the numbers. API families, by the way, had not heard about the citizenship question at all. Very, very exposed to it. And yet, obviously, a number of API families could have been affected and could be affected by citizenship issues. Slide 29. After acknowledging the ruling of the Supreme Court and noting that many may still be fearful, the top testing message for California overall was that it was important to count all young children because they are citizens of this country and will grow up here. And that language was very, very strong to people. And they loved the assertion that they are here and they will grow up here, and it is important to count them. And then linking it to specific services like schools, education, roads, housing. This was very strong with Latinx and Spanish-speaking parents, and it was very strong with making people more likely to fill out the sentence. Door-to-door census information, much less motivating. All of the things about filing taxes, constitutional requirements, felony punishment for revealing personal data, national organizations coming out, not that persuasive to people. And honestly, it was, there are two strategies here. One, really reassuring people that there is a penalty here, but also building up people's desire for what can come from the census. That's more effective than trying to reassure people about the census process. And then the other thing that was very, very important is being local, kind of shifting the focus. Focus local, focus on the services, the specific services that can be delivered. Talk about a problem that you're going to be able to solve and really paint a picture where people can envision at a values level, not just at a commodities level, what the census is going to provide for them. How do you reach people? Good Lord, people in California 30. It's amazing you have time to do anything. Californians are so involved on social media platforms. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, even Pinterest, very, very strong mediums across California. Very, very heavy penetration of a number of social media platforms. So where does this leave us? What's our strategy? I think it leads us into some subtle but very important shifting of the messaging that we have right now. Much of the existing messaging about the importance of the census is transactional, and it's people buying something or they're going to personally benefit. And while people did like their children benefiting, what they responded to much more were things that were values-oriented, people that were talking about your children, talking about the future, and talking about services that people consider values, like healthcare, like education. When we make things transactional, one of the biggest problems we have is fighting cynicism, that people believe, yeah, you say this, but in the end it won't happen. When we're transactional, it actually increases people's cynicism. When we're values-oriented, it helps overcome people's cynicism because it makes them want to take action to make changes and to make things better. People say, I'm going to count my kids. I'm going to count my kids. But they can imagine very easily a tremendous number of scenarios where kids would be left off. We had a section in the focus groups where we asked them to volunteer, and they were very, very eloquent. They could volunteer a ton of situations. So that's a bit of a disconnect, and it's a warning to us that it doesn't take much to tip people into situations where they're really unsure because of the instability of the housing, the mobility of the kids, and the shared custody. Some other strategies. Religious institutions are a very important piece of the strategy here. People are increasingly disconnected, and we need to find places where they are connected so that we can get them the information we need. Talking about the citizenship question, bringing the constitutional requirement, lifting up the Title 13 language, all of that's helpful in reassuring people. Equally helpful is talking to people about how convenient it is. People would prefer to fill it out online, and that number has increased dramatically. So we want to make people aware of access and to online and how easy it is online. Housing and transportation, incredibly important issues in California. And interestingly, while people didn't initially volunteer these as things that would help children, they did think it was things that were related to the census. Then when they came back around, having talked about children, they thought housing and transportation would help them too. They also thought education, healthcare, food programs would help children. People also love getting information from family members, teachers, child care providers, faith leaders, community centers, doctors, and nurses. These are trusted sources, community sources, values-oriented people who are also attached in some way to these services and resources. And that was quite powerful to people. We can share with you separately, as part of the national work, we actually did some fascinating focus groups. And this was Deb's innovation, was great with healthcare providers. And I think we learned quite a lot about how to approach them to get them involved in this effort. So that's kind of the summary. Let me turn it back to Deb to see if there's anything we missed or anything she wants to underscore, and then we can open up very briefly for questions because I know we have other people's comments as well.
Thanks. Please do put your questions in the chat box. We will send everybody who registered both the slides and the recording after the webinar. I should have mentioned earlier that this California research was all funded by the California Blue Shield Foundation to help support the count in California. And we're extremely grateful to them because it not only illuminated our understanding in California, but it also helped illuminate nationwide. Celinda, we have a question saying, can you talk about pregnant women and their understanding of counting a newborn or yet to be born child? And to answer that, I should say that the rule is you count kids who are born up to and including April 1st, even if they're still in the hospital, but not after that.
So we did not explore that in detail, although we did have a couple of people who brought it up. But we did not explore that in detail. And it's a great point that you're raising. And Deb, I would turn the question back to you, actually. I think it's an important thing to clarify for people. I think it would be very unclear and people would be very unlikely to count in utero pregnancies.
So I will combine that with the next question we got, which is, people get confused about completing the census for children under joint custody and what is the correct answer for how to count them. The answer is they're supposed to be counted at the house they spend and sleep most of their time at. And if you're not sure, then you count them for April 1st. But more generally, we have a fact sheet that we'll be putting up on our website, countallkids.org, in the next couple of weeks that talks about all the different scenarios for counting children. And if you go to countallkids.org and sign up for the campaign, you'll get all of that kind of material as we release them. So we will be releasing outreach tools, we'll be releasing a fact sheet on how to count kids, we'll be putting out a fact sheet on answering questions for providers so that they feel comfortable working with families to get them to count the census. And the easiest way to make sure you get it all is going to countallkids.org and then sign up for the campaign. I'm going to ask the next question to our California panelists. Are you partnered with any health centers or hospitals as part of your effort to count people? Myra?
Sure, I can start. This is Myra with the Children's Partnership. Absolutely. I think locally, our community health center community is very actively involved in connecting health and well-being to civic engagement opportunities, such as participating in the census. We're based here in Los Angeles. The Community Clinic Association of Los Angeles County has hosted events here with their community health center network in order to reach families through these trusted sources. We know that health clinics are a vital source of information and a trusted resource for families, so utilizing that communication vehicle to reach families with information related to the census is of utmost importance. It's also really important to consider connecting these issues of health and well-being to the census, given that many of the resources that the census numbers make possible are to support the health and well-being of our families. So yes, there are critical partners here, both at the local level and the statewide level.
And this is Kendra. Just to add, we just recently met with the with Valley Children's Hospital here in the Central Valley, and they are completely committed and on board with kind of supporting the effort in whatever way they can, and have also offered to reach out to their broader Children's Hospital Association and network statewide. So we are looking at developing through our communications firm some targeted messaging that's really specific to that, and to Myra's point, that really ties in kind of that overall, both what's kind of at stake around children's health with census, but also how those dollars really do help promote children's health as a whole. So those assets will be available as well, and we encourage all of you, as well in your planning to make sure you're looping in both your FQHC networks and your Children's Hospital networks.
We have another question, which is about who you partner with, which is which interfaith group or network are you working with in the greater Los Angeles region? Can anyone answer that?
I know that the state interfaith group is been PICO, and so they have been working on that. There's also Faith and Network, I think is the name of the organization, that's been working as one of the sector leads for the state. So, those are listed on the state Complete Counts website in terms of the sector leads.
And the only thing I'll add to Kendra's point is the importance of ensuring that our partners in every sector, whether it is the health sector or our faith and partners, have the information regarding the undercount of young children, given the disproportionate impact of this population. So as they're talking to their community, can we help them in relaying the necessary information to highlight the importance of counting young children and to clarify some of the questions that many of our community members have?
Great. Well, we're actually a little over, and we will, as I said, share the slides and the recording with everyone. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to ask our panelists if they have any final words before we close it today.
I was just going to say thank you all for participating, and all the resources will be shared afterwards, but please make sure to follow all of the social media for our three organizations to get census updates, and to make sure that you help us get the word out to colleagues in ensuring that children and families with kids 0 to 5 are part of all of the messaging to ensure that we have an accurate count.
Yeah, I would just love to thank Deb and your team and Myra and Justina for just such great partnership, and we're really excited to have all of the collective efforts working towards the goal of making sure all of our kids are counted.
And the only thing that I will add, this is Myra with the Children's Partnership, is again, extending our appreciation to our partners at First 5 Association and Children Now, as well as Partnership for America's Children. And to everyone on the line, I think want to reiterate that all of us are really committed to ensuring that our community partners, our statewide partners, our faith partners have the information that they need to help our families be counted. Please look to us as a resource and as your partners in our collective work to ensure every member of our California families are counted. These are trying times for many of our community members. And as we prepare for something as important as the 2020 census, we know we are that much stronger if we work together. So really count on us to be your partners. We look forward to staying in touch.
So I want to thank everyone, particularly Celinda. I also want to mention that this was really the highlights of the California research, believe it or not. We have a more in-depth report, which all of the partners who spoke on this webinar have. So if you have additional questions, you can email them or me and we'll try to answer them. The research was really incredibly detailed and useful, and we're very grateful for having the resources to be able to conduct it. I appreciate all of your interest in the census and trying to count kids. And really, when we boil it right down, the single most important message is just to tell them to count their kids, because they seem to be in doubt a lot of the time. Have a great day, and thank you for joining us.